The permit said I had 9 days to complete the mammal survey in the Gifford-Pinchot backcountry, Washington State, starting coordinates 46,2 degrees, 121, 8 degrees matter. It was late September, and the Douglas fir canopy was still dense enough to block most daylight by 4 in the afternoon. I'd been hired by the State Wildlife Department to document elk migration patterns and update predator counts after the previous winter's heavy snowfall. Standard field biology work, GPS collars, camera traps, scat analysis, nothing complicated. Day 4 started at 5:50 a.m. with fog so thick I couldn't see past 20 feet. Temperature hovered at 41 degrees. I was hiking a ridge trail that connected 2 camera stations, carrying a weatherproof case with SD cards and spare batteries. The route was supposed to take 3 hours round trip. I'd done it twice before without incident. Around mile 2, I noticed the first thing. The birdsong stopped. Not gradually. It cut off like someone flipped a switch. I've worked in forests for 11 years, and that kind of silence usually means a predator is nearby. I stopped walking and scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. The fog pressed in from all sides, turning everything grey and flat. I waited 5 minutes, then kept going. My boots crunched on the gravel path, each step too loud in the emptiness. Camera station number 4 was intact, but showed signs of interference. The mounting bracket had been bent downward, and the lens was smudged with what looked like mud. When I checked the footage, the last 3 days were corrupted, just black frames and timestamp errors. Station Tower 6, half a mile east, was worse. The entire unit had been twisted off its tree mount and left hanging by the security cable. The casing wasn't cracked, just rotated 180 degrees. It would have taken significant force to do that without breaking anything. I documented everything with photos and logged the damage in my field notebook. Possible bear interference, both stations compromised. But I'd seen bear damage before. They usually rip cameras down and chew on them or bat them around. This was different, deliberate almost, like something was testing the equipment. The trail beyond station number 6 showed fresh disturbances in the duff layer, large impressions that didn't match elk or deer. I knelt down and measured one with my tape. 17 inches long, 7 inches across at the widest point. The depth suggested something heavy, maybe 400 pounds or more. The stride length was roughly 6 feet between prints. I took photos from multiple angles and collected a soil sample from the deepest impression. My radio crackled with static. I tried raising base camp, but got nothing except feedback. Cell service was non-existent this far in, so I wasn't surprised. What did bother me was the static itself. It had a rhythmic quality, like a pattern repeating every few seconds. I switched channels. Same thing. I turned it off and kept moving. By noon, I'd covered another mile and found more prints. They followed the trail for about 200 yards, then veered off into dense underbrush, heading upslope toward a rocky outcrop. Protocol said I should mark the location and return to base. The prints were unusual enough to warrant a full investigation team, and I wasn't equipped for off-trail work in this terrain. But the day was still young, and I had enough water and gear for another 4 hours minimum. I stood there weighing options. The prints were fresh, maybe only hours old based on how sharp the edges were. If I came back tomorrow with a team, rain was forecast and we'd lose everything. I had a handheld GPS, two-way radio, emergency beacon, and enough experience to navigate back if things got complicated. The logical choice was to follow the tracks just far enough to get a sense of where they led. I stepped off the trail at 12:17 p.m. The underbrush was thick with salal and Oregon grape, and the slope was steep enough that I had to use my hands to pull myself up in places. The prints were harder to follow here. just broken branches and disturbed moss. After about 20 minutes, the terrain leveled out, and the forest opened into a small clearing, maybe 40 feet across. That's where I found the first structure. 3 saplings had been bent over and interwoven to form an arch about 7 feet high. The trunks were still green and alive, twisted together with enough force to splinter the bark. It stood in the center of the clearing, surrounded by smaller debris, branches arranged in radial patterns, stones piled in deliberate cairns. I circled it slowly, taking photos. This wasn't wind damage or natural fall. Someone or something had constructed this. The question was why? Territorial marker? Shelter? I reached out and touched one of the bent saplings. The wood was damp and cold, but the breakpoints were recent. Within the last week, I guessed. A stick snapped behind me. I spun around. Nothing, just fog and trees. But I felt it then. The weight of being watched. My pulse kicked up, and I reached for the radio before remembering I'd turned it off. I powered it back on. The static returned immediately, louder than before, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. I backed away from the structure and started retracing my route downslope. The feeling didn't fade. If anything, it intensified. Every shadow seemed deliberate, every rustle calculated. I told myself it was adrenaline, pattern recognition, gone haywire. But the rational part of my brain was losing ground to something older, something instinctive. When I reached the main trail, I broke into a jog. I didn't look back. I made it back to base camp by 4:30 p.m., legs shaking from the pace. My supervisor, Derek, was updating inventory logs when I walked in. He took one look at me and asked if I was all right. I told him about the damaged cameras and the prints, kept my tone professional, stuck to measurements and observations. I didn't mention the structure or the feeling of being watched. Not yet. I needed to think it through first. That night, I went through the photos on my camera. The prints were clear enough to compare against reference databases. The arch structure looked exactly like the formations described in old field reports I'd read in college, reports I'd dismissed as folklore contamination in otherwise legitimate research. Reports about territorial markers left by something that wasn't supposed to exist. I slept badly, kept hearing branches snapping outside the tent, kept waking up to check my watch. At 3 a.m., I gave up and made coffee. Derek's tent was dark and quiet. I sat on a camp stool and opened my notebook, trying to list rational explanations. Hoax, misidentified bear prints, coincidental wind damage, none of it fit. By dawn, I'd made my decision. I was going back, but this time properly equipped. I packed a larger field bag with extra batteries, a measuring tape, evidence bags, a better camera with a telephoto lens, and my backup GPS unit. I also took the flare gun from the emergency kit. Derek asked where I was headed. I told him I was checking the western camera line, which was technically true since it ran near the area I planned to search. The fog had lifted overnight, and visibility was good under a high grey sky. Temperature was 48 degrees, no wind. I reached the clearing by 9:15 a.m. The arch structure was still there, exactly as I'd left it. In daylight, it looked less ominous and more deliberate, engineered. I took detailed photos from every angle and collected samples of the bark from the bent saplings. The break patterns showed torsion force applied in a consistent direction, counterclockwise. Not random. I spent an hour documenting everything in the clearing, then followed the line of cairns that radiated from the arch. They led east, uphill again, toward a series of limestone cliffs I'd seen on the topographic map. The going was easier this time. Someone or something had been using this route regularly enough to create a faint path through the undergrowth. At the base of the cliffs, I found the cave entrance. Not large, maybe 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, partially hidden behind a fallen log. The opening descended at a steep angle into darkness. I knelt down and aimed my flashlight inside. The beam revealed a narrow passage that curved out of sight after about 15 feet. The air coming from the cave was warmer than the outside temperature and carried a smell I couldn't quite place. Musky, organic, not unpleasant, but definitely animal. I should have marked the location and returned to base. Every protocol said so. But I was already past that point, wasn't I? I'd already followed the prints, already entered the clearing, already ignored the feeling that told me to stay away. And now I was looking at something that might actually explain the damaged cameras, the prints, the structure. Physical evidence that couldn't be dismissed. I checked my GPS. The signal was weak but holding. I activated the tracking function so my route would be recorded. I set my radio to the emergency channel and left it on. Then I removed my backpack, pulled out the flashlight and a smaller LED headlamp, and started into the cave. The passage was tight for the first 20 feet, forcing me to crouch and sidestep in places. The limestone walls were damp and cold. My headlamp beam showed scratch marks along both sides, long parallel grooves that suggested claws or fingernails. The passage widened gradually, and after about 50 feet, it opened into a larger chamber. I stood up slowly, panning the light across the space. The chamber was roughly circular, maybe 20 feet across and 10 feet high at the center. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dried vegetation, grass, ferns, cedar boughs, arranged in a way that suggested bedding. Along the walls were more structures, bones stacked in piles, sorted by size, deer vertebrae in one pile, ribs in another, skulls lined up in a row. None of them looked gnawed or cracked for marrow. They'd been cleaned and arranged deliberately. In the center of the chamber was a ring of stones surrounding a shallow depression filled with charcoal and ash. A fire pit, recent enough that I could still smell the smoke residue. Whoever used this cave understood fire. That single detail changed everything. I moved closer to the bone piles, careful not to disturb anything. Most were from deer and elk, but I spotted smaller bones too. Rodent skulls, bird wings, fish spines, all sorted, all cleaned. It reminded me of a museum collection or a natural history display. The organization implied intention, maybe even curiosity. My radio squawked with static. I jumped, fumbling to turn down the volume. The static resolved into something almost like syllables, low, modulated, repeating. I held the radio up and listened. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, then cut off. I waited. Nothing. I turned back to the chamber, and that's when I saw the drawings. On the back wall, above the sorted bones, someone had used charcoal or burned wood to mark the stone. Simple figures, stick representations of animals, elk with antlers, bears, birds, and in the center, larger than the others, a human figure standing upright. Beside it, another figure, taller, wider, with longer arms. The two figures had one hand raised toward each other, not touching but close. I stood there trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't a bear den or a mountain lion cache. This was something else, something aware of itself and its place in relation to humans. The drawing wasn't crude. It showed proportion, understanding, intent. A sound echoed from deeper in the cave. Not static this time. A low vocalization, throaty and sustained, like a question or a warning. It came from a passage on the far side of the chamber that I hadn't noticed before, just a dark gap between two rock formations. I backed toward the entrance, keeping my light pointed forward. The vocalization repeated, closer now. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had two choices: leave immediately and risk never getting another chance at documentation, or stay and try to make contact with whatever lived here. The rational part of my brain screamed to run, but I didn't. I stayed. I lowered my backpack to the ground slowly, making myself smaller, less threatening. My hands were shaking, but I forced them steady. I switched off my headlamp and stood in the dim light filtering from the entrance, letting my eyes adjust. The vocalization came again, softer this time, from the dark passage across the chamber. What I did next wasn't bravery. It was something closer to compulsion, the same instinct that makes you lean over a cliff edge to look down, knowing you shouldn't. I took 3 steps toward the passage and stopped. Then I made a sound back. Not words, just a low hum in my throat, sustained for a few seconds. Neutral, non-aggressive. Silence. Long enough that I thought I'd scared whatever it was deeper into the cave. Then I heard movement, not footsteps exactly, but the shuffle of something large shifting position. A smell reached me, stronger now, musky and earthy, like wet dog mixed with pine sap. A shape emerged from the passage. In the low light it was just a silhouette, but the scale was wrong for any animal I knew. Tall enough that it had to duck slightly. Broad shoulders, arms that hung past where human arms would end. It stopped at the edge of the fire pit, maybe 12 feet from where I stood. We looked at each other. I couldn't make out details, just the outline and the reflection of ambient light on what might have been eyes. My entire body wanted to run. Every nerve fired warnings. But I held still because I understood something in that moment. If it wanted to hurt me, it already would have. I was in its home. I was the intruder. It made a sound, not the vocalization from before, but something shorter. A grunt or a huff. Then it turned and moved back into the passage, disappeared into the dark. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, trying to convince myself I'd actually seen it. Then I noticed something on the ground near the fire pit. A piece of root vegetable, partially peeled, still wet. Fresh. And beside it, a small pile of what looked like berries, salmon berries maybe, or thimble berries, the kind you'd gather in late summer. Food left out, an offering or a test. I didn't touch it. Instead, I backed toward the entrance, picked up my pack, and left the cave the way I'd come. Outside, the daylight felt artificial and too bright. I sat on the fallen log and tried to slow my breathing. My watch said 10:47 a.m. I'd been in the cave for just over an hour. It felt like longer. I should have headed back to base camp then, filed a report, let someone else handle it. But I couldn't shake the memory of that drawing, the 2 figures with raised hands. It felt like an invitation, or at least acknowledgement that contact was possible, maybe even desired. I spent the rest of the day in the area, keeping my distance from the cave, but documenting everything within a 100-yard radius. I found more signs, trees stripped of bark at shoulder height, creating clear sightlines, a fallen log that had been hollowed out and repositioned across a small creek, forming a bridge, scat deposits covered with leaves and moss, buried deliberately, evidence of hygiene, planning, tool use. At one point, I found a flat rock with dozens of small pebbles arranged on its surface in patterns, concentric circles, straight lines, triangles. I photographed it, but didn't disturb the arrangement. Nearby, wedged into the fork of a young alder, was a cluster of feathers tied together with what looked like stripped bark fiber. Not random. Decorative, maybe, or symbolic. The sun was dropping behind the ridge when I noticed I was being followed. Not sounds exactly, more like the absence of sound in specific places. I'd stop walking, and the forest would pause with me. I'd start again, and hear the faint crack of a branch somewhere behind or to the side. Never close enough to see, but present enough to be deliberate. I tested it. Stopped abruptly, counted to 10, took 3 steps left. A moment later, the soft thump of something heavy moving through undergrowth, adjusting course. It was tracking me, matching my pace, maintaining distance, not stalking, escorting, making sure I left the area. By the time I reached the main trail, the feeling lifted. I was outside the boundary, whatever that meant. I hiked the last mile back to camp as twilight settled in, arriving just before full dark at 6:20 p.m. Derek was cooking dinner on the camp stove. He asked if I'd had any luck with the Western cameras. I told him they were fine, no issues. He nodded and went back to stirring instant noodles. I couldn't tell him what I'd found. Not yet. He'd pull the plug on the survey, bring in a full team, turn the whole area into a circus. And I wasn't ready for that. I was scheduled to do a final check on the northern camera stations the next day, but I knew I wouldn't. I'd go back to the cave. I had to. Because the thing I hadn't mentioned to Derek, the detail I was still trying to process, was what I'd seen as I left the chamber that morning. On the ground near the entrance, arranged in the dirt, were 3 objects: a pine cone, a smooth river stone, and a rusted bottle cap, the kind of random debris you'd find anywhere in the woods, except they were placed in a line, evenly spaced, pointing toward the main passage, and beside them, pressed into the soft earth, was a handprint. Not a paw print, not a bear track. A hand. 4 fingers and an opposable thumb, roughly twice the size of my own palm, but undeniably a hand. I'd taken a photo before I left, zooming in to capture every detail. Back in my tent that night, I studied the image on my camera's LCD screen. The dermal ridges were visible in the dirt impression. Fingerprints, whirls and loops, evidence of individuality, of unique identity. This wasn't just an intelligent animal. This was a person, a different kind of person, but a person nonetheless. And I'd walked into their home without permission, documented their belongings, invaded their privacy. The weight of that realization sat in my chest like a stone. I deleted the photo of the handprint. Not the others. Those could be explained away as natural formations or animal behavior. But the handprint was different. That was proof, and proof would bring consequences. For both of us. I lay in my sleeping bag and listened to the night sounds of the forest. Somewhere out there, in the dark, something was listening too. We'd acknowledged each other. The question now was what came next. I woke before dawn and told Derek I was hiking out early to maximize daylight. He grunted something about radio check-ins and went back to sleep. I was on the trail by 5:40 a.m., headlamp cutting through pre-dawn darkness, carrying a lighter pack this time. No collection equipment, no measurement tools. Just water, energy bars, a first aid kit, and my camera with a nearly full battery. The plan was simple: return to the cave, leave something of my own near the entrance, and see what happened. A gesture of reciprocity. I'd brought a package of beef jerky and a small multi-tool, practical items that showed good faith. Whether it made sense to treat this like a cultural exchange, or I was just projecting human behavior onto something I didn't understand, I couldn't say. But I had to try. The forest was still quiet when I reached the clearing at 7:15 a.m. The arch structure remained undisturbed, and morning mist clung to the ground in patches. I approached the cave entrance slowly, announcing myself with a low whistle, giving warning of my presence. The items I'd seen yesterday, the pine cone, stone, and bottle cap, were gone. In their place was something new. A small bundle of dried herbs tied with grass, and next to it, a bird's skull that had been cleaned and polished until it was nearly white. The arrangement felt ceremonial. I set my offerings on the flat rock beside the bundle and stepped back. Then I sat down on the ground, about 15 feet from the entrance, cross-legged, hands visible and empty. I waited. 20 minutes passed. The sun climbed higher and burned off the mist. Birds started calling again. Robins, jays, a distant woodpecker. Normal forest sounds. I was beginning to think I'd misread everything when I heard movement from inside the cave. It emerged slowly, deliberately, giving me time to see it. In full daylight, the details resolved into something my brain struggled to categorize. 8 feet tall, maybe taller, covered in dark reddish-brown hair that was longer on the head and shoulders, shorter on the torso and limbs. The face was flatter than an ape's, with a prominent brow ridge and deep-set eyes that caught the morning light. The eyes were not animal eyes. They had whites, and they focused with clear intent. It stood at the cave entrance and looked at me. I looked back. My heart was pounding, but I kept my breathing steady, kept my posture relaxed. No sudden movements, no aggressive displays, just presence. After what felt like a full minute, it picked up the beef jerky and examined it, turning the package over in its hands. The hands were massive, with thick fingers and dark nails, but the manipulation was precise, more precise than I'd expected. It opened the package by pulling the seal, not tearing it, and smelled the contents. Then it made a sound, a soft huff that might have been approval or just acknowledgement. It took a single piece of jerky and ate it, chewing thoughtfully. Then it set the package down and picked up the multi-tool. It unfolded the knife blade, tested the edge with a thumb, folded it back, and opened the pliers. Examined each tool in sequence. When it finished, it looked directly at me and made a series of sounds, low, modulated, almost conversational, in rhythm. Not words, but definitely communication. I responded without thinking. I don't understand you. My voice sounded strange in the stillness, too human and out of place, but it seemed to register meaning anyway, or at least tone. It made another sound, shorter, then gestured toward the cave entrance with one hand, an invitation. Every survival instinct told me no, but I'd come this far. I stood up slowly, keeping eye contact, and took 3 steps forward. It moved aside, giving me space to enter. The dynamic had shifted. I wasn't sneaking in this time. I was being welcomed. Inside the main chamber, more details became visible in the better light filtering from outside. The sorted bones were more extensive than I'd realized, covering nearly half the back wall. The drawings had been added to, new figures, more animals, and something that looked like the moon phases. The fire pit showed signs of recent use, with new ash layered over old. It gestured to a flat area near the fire ring, indicating I should sit. I did. It sat across from me, close enough that I could smell the musk, could see the texture of the hair, could count the lines in the weathered face. Not a face like mine, but undeniably a face with expressions I could partially read. It reached behind itself and pulled forward a woven basket I hadn't noticed before. Strips of cedar bark interlaced in a simple but functional pattern. Inside were more herbs, roots, and what looked like dried fish. It took a piece of fish and ate it, then pushed the basket toward me, offering to share its food. I took a small piece of the dried fish and ate it. It was heavily smoked, slightly bitter, but not unpleasant. The gesture felt significant. We were eating together, acknowledging each other as entities worthy of hospitality. For the next hour we sat there in near silence. It showed me other items, a collection of smooth stones in graduated sizes, a piece of quartz that had been shaped into a rough blade, a section of deer antler with notches carved along its length. Each item was presented carefully, almost reverently, and each seemed to mean something I couldn't quite grasp. They weren't just tools or possessions. They were memories, records, proof of a life lived with intention. At one point, it touched its chest, then gestured to the space around us with a sweeping motion. "This is mine." Then it pointed at me and made the same gesture toward the cave entrance and beyond. "That is yours." A boundary acknowledged, a territory respected. I understood then that my assumption had been backwards. I wasn't discovering it. It had been observing me, studying me for days. The damaged cameras, the tracks that led me here, the offerings at the cave entrance, all of it had been deliberate. A test to see if I was safe, if I could be trusted. And by coming back, by sitting down and waiting, by accepting its invitation, I'd passed. The weight of that realization was crushing. I'd walked into the forest thinking I was the scientist, the observer, the one with agency and understanding. But I'd been the subject all along, and this being across from me, this person, had been the one deciding what happened next. It stood abruptly and moved to the back wall, to the drawing of the two figures with raised hands. It placed one hand on the taller figure, then pointed at me and touched the smaller one. Then it drew something new in the charcoal dust below the original image, a line connecting the two figures. Not touching, but linked, a relationship established. Not friendship, that would take time and understanding I didn't have, but acknowledgement, mutual recognition. We existed in the same world, and we'd chosen not to be enemies. It walked past me, toward the entrance. I stood and followed, understanding the visit was over. Outside, in the bright midday sun, it paused and looked at me one more time. Then it turned and walked into the forest, moving with impossible quiet for something so large. Within seconds it had vanished into the undergrowth. I stood there until the forest sounds returned to normal. Then I collected my pack and started back toward camp, knowing everything had changed. Derek was waiting at the trail junction when I got back, sitting on a deadfall log with his pack beside him. He had his satellite phone out, which meant something was wrong. He looked up when I approached, and his expression confirmed it. "Where the hell have you been? I've been trying to raise you on the radio for 3 hours." I checked my radio. Still on, but the battery was dead. I'd forgotten to monitor the charge. "Sorry. Lost track of time. What's going on?" Regional office called. They're sending a team out tomorrow morning. 4 people, wildlife enforcement, and a tracking specialist. Someone filed a report about possible illegal trapping activity in this sector. They want our survey data and full site access. My stomach dropped. Who filed the report? Didn't say. Anonymous tip, apparently. But they're taking it seriously enough to scramble a response team. He stood and shouldered his pack. "We need to get everything organized tonight. They'll want to see all our camera data, GPS logs, field notes, everything." I nodded, trying to keep my face neutral, but my mind was racing. If an enforcement team came through with tracking specialists, they'd find the cave within hours. They'd document everything, the structures, the sorted bones, the drawings. They'd classify it as evidence of an undocumented species, and the whole area would be locked down for study. Or worse, they'd decide it was an elaborate hoax and accuse Derek and me of falsifying data. That night, I went through my field notes and removed any references to the cave or the unusual prints. I kept the entries about the damaged cameras and the arch structure. Those were explainable without raising red flags. The photos on my camera were a bigger problem. I'd documented too much. I transferred the images to my laptop and deleted everything that showed clear evidence of intelligent construction. It felt like betrayal, but I told myself I was protecting something that didn't want to be found. Around midnight, I made a decision I knew was stupid but couldn't avoid. I had to warn it, had to give it a chance to hide anything that might lead the enforcement team to the cave. It was anthropomorphizing, projecting human concepts of danger and consequence onto something that might not understand either. But I had to try. I left camp at 1 a.m. with my headlamp set to red light mode to preserve night vision. Derek was asleep. The forest at night was a different entity. Sounds amplified, distances distorted, every shadow potentially threatening. It took me twice as long to reach the clearing, and I stumbled more than once on roots and rocks I'd navigated easily in daylight. The arch structure was invisible in the darkness, just a deeper black against the trees. I kept my light pointed down and moved toward the cave entrance by memory and GPS coordinates. When I was close, I called out softly, "It's me. From this morning." No response. I tried again, louder. "There are people coming. Tomorrow. They'll search this area." Still nothing. Maybe it wasn't here. Maybe it was out hunting or sleeping somewhere else. I couldn't stay long. If Derek woke up and found me gone, he'd panic and possibly call for a search. I left the multi-tool I'd brought on the flat rock near the entrance, along with a note I'd written on a page torn from my field book. "Hide everything. They're coming." Pointless, probably. It couldn't read English, but the action of leaving felt necessary, even if the message was incomprehensible. I turned to head back, and that's when I heard them. Voices, human voices, coming from the direction of the main trail. Too many for just Derek. Flashlight, beams cut through the trees, closer than they should have been. The enforcement team wasn't supposed to arrive until morning, but someone was here now, and they were heading toward the clearing. I killed my headlamp and moved fast, trying to put distance between myself and the cave entrance. I made it maybe 50 yards before a spotlight hit me square in the face, blinding and hot. "Forest Service, stop where you are!" I froze, hands up. The light stayed on me, while boots approached through the undergrowth. 3 people materialized, 2 in Forest Service uniforms, and 1 in civilian clothes, carrying professional camera equipment. The civilian was young, maybe late 20s, with the overeager expression of someone hoping for a big story. "You're Brenner? The wildlife tech?" The lead officer was a woman, mid-40s with a no-nonsense tone. "Yeah, what's going on? Derek said you weren't coming until morning." "Plans changed. We got a tip that someone was out here tampering with evidence. That wouldn't be you, would it?" Behind them, more lights appeared. 2 additional people emerging from the forest, one carrying what looked like thermal imaging equipment. This wasn't a standard enforcement check. This was a coordinated operation. "I don't know what you're talking about. I was just checking camera stations." At 1 in the morning, the civilian with the camera stepped forward. "Come on, man. We know something's out here. We've got footage from 3 weeks ago. Something big moving through this area, taking down cameras. Whatever you found, it's going to come out anyway. You might as well cooperate." I felt sick. This wasn't about illegal trapping. Someone had been watching this area long before I arrived. They'd been waiting for something to surface, and I'd led them right to it. A sound erupted from the cave, loud, piercing, somewhere between a scream and a roar. The kind of sound that triggers every primal fear coded into human DNA. The spotlight swung toward the source, and for a second, I saw it. A massive silhouette at the cave entrance, backlit by someone's headlamp, before it turned and disappeared into the darkness. "Get the thermal camera on it! Move! Move!" The lead officer was shouting now, and everyone was running toward the cave. I stood paralyzed, watching my worst fear unfold in real time. They were going to document everything, capture everything, turn it into a spectacle. I ran. Not toward the cave. There was nothing I could do there. I ran east, upslope, toward the rocky area I'd scouted 2 days earlier. If it had any sense, it would go deep, find another hiding place, stay away from humans until this blew over. But I knew it wouldn't. This was its home. It had nowhere else to go. I heard shouting behind me, someone calling my name, but I didn't stop. I crashed through undergrowth, branches whipping my face, lungs burning. The slope got steeper, and I used my hands to pull myself up, grabbed roots and rocks, anything to keep moving. Somewhere ahead of me, something else was moving through the trees. Heavy footfalls, breaking branches. I caught glimpses of a large shape, darker than the surrounding darkness, heading parallel to my route. It was flanking me, or I was flanking it. Either way, we were moving in the same direction, away from the lights and voices. The ground leveled out, and I burst into a small clearing. The shape was there, standing at the far edge, watching me. We looked at each other across 20 feet of moonlit space. Its chest was heaving, breathing hard like mine. In its hand, it held something, the multi-tool I'd left at the cave. It had grabbed it before running. Behind us, the voices were getting closer. Ahead, the terrain dropped off into a steep ravine I could barely make out in the darkness. No good options. It made a sound, that same low vocalization from the cave, but urgent now. Then it turned and moved along the ridge, following a path I couldn't see. I followed without thinking. If it knew this terrain, maybe it knew a way out. We moved for maybe 10 minutes, me struggling to keep pace, it gliding through the darkness like the forest was part of its body. The voices faded behind us. Finally it stopped at what looked like a sheer rock face and placed both hands against the stone. Then it moved sideways, revealing a narrow gap, a fissure in the cliff barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It looked at me once more, then disappeared into the gap. I hesitated for maybe 2 seconds before following. The passage was claustrophobic, barely shoulder width, and it curved sharply after a few feet. I couldn't see anything. I just felt my way forward, hands on damp stone, following the sound of breathing ahead of me. After what felt like forever but was probably less than a minute, the passage opened up and I stumbled out onto a narrow ledge. Below was darkness. Above, a thin strip of sky with stars. And beside me, breathing hard, the creature I'd just helped escape from discovery. We stood there catching our breath, while the sounds of the search party echoed distant and confused through the forest. They'd lost us. For now. We stayed on that ledge until dawn started to grey the sky. Neither of us moved much. I sat with my back against cold stone, trying to slow my heart rate and process what had just happened. It stood at the edge, watching the forest below, listening to the distant sounds of the search party moving through the trees in wrong directions. Around 5:30 a.m., when the light was strong enough to see by, it turned to me and made a series of soft sounds. Not the urgent vocalizations from earlier, something gentler, almost conversational. Then it pointed downslope, away from the cave and the clearing, toward a drainage system I recognized from the topographic maps, a route back to the main trail that would bypass the search area entirely. It started moving, and I followed. We descended, carefully, using game trails and natural ledges that would have taken me hours to find alone. It moved with absolute confidence, never hesitating, never second-guessing. This was its territory in a way that went beyond ownership. It was part of this landscape the same way the trees and rocks were. At the bottom of the ravine, where a small creek cut through moss-covered stones, it stopped and turned to face me. The morning light caught its features clearly now. I could see the intelligence in its eyes, the intentionality in its posture. This was the last time we'd see each other. We both knew it. It touched its chest, then pointed at me, then made a gesture that swept across the forest. The meaning was clear. Your people are dangerous to me. Stay away, I nodded, unable to speak. It studied my face for a long moment, then did something I wasn't expecting. It reached out and touched my shoulder, just briefly, just enough to make contact. Not a threat, an acknowledgement. Then it turned and walked upstream, moving against the current, placing each step carefully on rocks that wouldn't leave tracks. Within 30 seconds it had rounded a bend and disappeared. I stood there alone in the growing light, listening to the creek and the birds and the wind in the trees. All evidence that it had ever existed was gone, except for the weight of its hand on my shoulder and the memory of its eyes. I made it back to camp by 7 a.m. The place was chaos, more vehicles than I'd seen, people in uniforms and civilian clothes moving equipment, someone setting up what looked like a command station near Derek's tent. Derek himself was standing with the lead officer from last night, and when he saw me, his face went through several emotions before settling on anger. "Where the hell have you been?" I told them I'd gotten disoriented in the dark and spent the night sheltering under a rock overhang. The lead officer, her name was Peterson, asked why I'd been out there in the first place. I said I couldn't sleep and went for a walk, heard commotion, panicked. All of it technically true, all of it missing the essential facts. They searched for 3 more days. Thermal imaging, tracking dogs, motion cameras, the works. They found the cave and documented everything inside. The fire pit, the sorted bones, the drawings. The official report classified it as possible evidence of undocumented hominid activity, but stopped short of any definitive conclusions. The sorted bones were interesting. The drawings were interesting. But without clear photographic or physical evidence of the creature itself, it remained in the realm of speculation. Derek was furious with me for the entire process. He knew I was holding something back, knew my story didn't add up. But he couldn't prove it, and eventually the team packed up and left. The sector was placed under temporary research restriction, pending further investigation. Our survey data was confiscated. Derek was reassigned to a different project. I was thanked for my cooperation and quietly let go. That was 11 months ago. I work as a data analyst now, reviewing wildlife reports from a desk in Olympia. It's steady, it's boring, and it requires 0 fieldwork. I don't miss the forest the way I thought I would. Every time I think about going back, I remember that touch on my shoulder and the trust it represented. The trust I almost violated. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, in the caves and clearings of the Gifford Pinchot. If it found a new home deeper in the wilderness where humans don't go. If it thinks about that morning the same way I do. The footage that Civilian had mentioned, the reason they knew to search that area, turned up online about 6 months after I left. Grainy, distant, could be anything. The comment section is full of believers and skeptics arguing in circles, neither side proving anything. I've never posted my own photos. The ones I kept show interesting patterns in forest debris, unusual tree formations, evidence that could suggest intelligence or could suggest nothing at all. The handprint photo, the one I deleted, haunts me more than any of the others. It was proof, and I destroyed it. Sometimes I think I did the right thing. Sometimes I think I was a coward. The multi-tool turned up in my jacket pocket 3 weeks after the incident. I have no memory of taking it back, which means it must have given it to me during that last meeting by the creek. I keep it in a drawer in my apartment, and every time I see it, I'm reminded that I was chosen. Tested and chosen. Trusted with knowledge that I can never share in a way that would be believed. Late at night, when I can't sleep, I think about that drawing on the cave wall. The 2 figures with the line connecting them. Not touching, but linked. I hope they didn't find it. I hope the next researcher who enters that cave sees only empty stone and assumes the rest was erosion or moisture patterns or imagination. I hope the sector stays restricted long enough for it to fade completely. But mostly, I hope that somewhere in the deep forest, in the places that still exist beyond human reach, there's a being that remembers our agreement, that respects boundaries the way I'm trying to respect its, that understands I kept it secret not because I don't believe, but because I do. Some things aren't meant to be proven. Some knowledge isn't meant to be shared. And some connections, once made, change you in ways that can't be explained to anyone who wasn't there. I carry that weight now. The weight of knowing and choosing silence. The weight of a trust I'll never be able to fully honor or fully betray. I deleted my field reports. I removed the GPS coordinates. I claimed faulty equipment and unreliable data. And when people ask me now if I believe in Bigfoot, I tell them the same thing I tell myself. The forest is bigger than we think, and maybe that's how it should stay.